The town of Hallow Bend, Montana, held its estate auction on the second Friday of every October. It was not called an estate auction. It was called a settlement liquidation, which was the kind of name that made a hard thing sound administrative. When a homestead failed, and in the winter of 1883, homesteads in the Bitterroot Valley were failing the way crops fail, quietly and then all at once. The county sent a man named Pruitt with a ledger and a cart, and whatever remained of a life got sold on the courthouse steps to whoever showed up. Most things went fast. Tools went first, a good plow, a working harrow, a set of farrier's irons, then the livestock, such as it was. Then the furniture, piece by piece, to women who appraised each item with the particular economy of people who have been making do for so long that making do has become a kind of expertise. Vera Holcomb stood at the back of the crowd with her hands in the pockets of her work coat and no particular intention of buying anything. She was 28 years old, a schoolteacher without a permanent posting, who had come to Hallow Bend 6 weeks ago for a temporary position covering a class while the regular teacher recovered from a broken wrist. The regular teacher's wrist had healed faster than expected. Vera had stayed anyway because the boarding house was cheaper than moving and because she had nowhere specific to be. She had walked past the settlement liquidation on her way to the post office. She stopped because of the boy. He was sitting on the courthouse steps apart from the things being sold, which told its own story. He was perhaps 9 years old, though he was small enough to be taken for younger. Very small, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. Brown hair cut close, a jacket that was too large in the shoulders because it had belonged to someone bigger, and boots that had been re-soled at least twice with leather of different colors. His hands were folded on his knees. He was watching the crowd sell off what had been his home with the expression of someone who has already done his grieving and arrived at something past it. Vera had watched 3 women approach him, not unkindly. Hallow Bend was not an unkind town, as towns went, but with the particular hesitation of people who had come looking for something manageable, and this was not quite it. Too quiet. Too old in the eyes. Not the child you'd picture when you pictured taking one on. The boy watched each woman go without moving, which was worse, somehow, than if he'd looked after them. Vera was still standing there when the county man, Pruitt, closed his ledger and looked at the boy and looked at the remaining crowd, which had thinned considerably, and finally looked at Vera with the expression of a man who has one item left on a list and a wagon to return before dark. "You looking?" Pruitt said, not expectantly. More the way a man asks when he already knows. The answer is probably no. Vera looked at the boy looked at Vera, not pleadingly, just directly the way someone looks when they have decided to assess rather than hope. "What's his name?" Vera said. "Emmett," Pruitt said. "Emmett Greer. Father died of fever in September. Mother gone 2 years before that. No other family located. He's been with the Halversons since October, but they're moving to Oregon and can't take him." "How old?" 9. Turned 9 in August. Vera looked at her boots, then at Emmett Greer, who had not looked away, and who had not in the entire time she had been watching shown anything that looked like self-pity. Assessment. Only assessment. "What's the placement fee?" she said. $3, Pruitt said. "Covers the county's administrative costs." Vera reached into her coat pocket. She had $4 and some cents, which was what remained of last month's pay after the boarding house and the week's meals. She counted out 3. She was not entirely sure, while counting them, what she was doing or why. She had a room, not a home. She had a temporary position that had already ended. She was 28 years old and had no experience with children outside a classroom, and no particular qualifications for what she had just agreed to. She was not even sure she was staying in Hallow Bend past the month. Emmett Greer stood up from the courthouse steps while Pruitt filled out the paperwork, and when it was done, he picked up the small bundle beside him and looked at her. The bundle was wrapped in a flour sack and tied with string. It was very small. "Where do we go?" he said. His voice was level. No tremor. the question of someone who intends to understand their situation. "Back to my boarding house for now," Vera said. "Then I'm not entirely sure." "Not sure," he repeated. "That's what I've got," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, not the nod of a relieved child. The nod of someone who has evaluated the available information and decided it is enough to proceed on. They walked back to the boarding house on Fletcher Street, Vera and Emmett side by side, Emmett carrying his bundle, Vera carrying the receipt Pruitt had given her, which was the only documentation she had that any of this had legally occurred. She was a woman who'd just spent $3 on a responsibility she hadn't planned for, in a town she hadn't planned to stay in, and the child walking beside her had the composure of someone twice his age. She didn't know what to make of any of it. She walked and she thought, and she said nothing, and neither did he. That was how it began. The boarding house was run by a woman named Odette Sayers, who was 54 years old and had been running it for 20 years, and who had, during that time, developed the ability to take in information and respond to it practically rather than emotionally. When Vera walked in with Emmett, Odette looked at him, looked at Vera, and said, "He'll need a cot. There's one in the storage room I can bring up." That was all she said. Vera would later think of this as one of the more merciful things anyone did for her that year. Emmett slept on the cot in Vera's room. He was quiet at night, which she noticed because she had expected otherwise. He woke early, which she also noticed and which she discovered on the third morning was because he had been getting up to help Odette in the kitchen before breakfast. Not because anyone asked him. Because he had assessed the situation, identified where he could be useful, and been useful. "That boy," Odette said, the third morning, "has more sense than half the men who've ever stayed here. Don't tell them I said so." "Where did you learn to do all this?" Vera asked Emmett that evening. "My mother couldn't get up much in the last year," he said. "Someone had to do things." He said it without complaint. This was, Vera would come to understand, one of his consistent qualities. He narrated his life accurately, without adding weight to it that it didn't need. She found this increasingly to be one of the most steadying qualities a person could have. She had begun without particularly planning to, looking for him when she came in at the end of the day. It was not that she was anxious when he was not there. It was the simpler thing of having learned to expect him, and noticing when what she expected was absent. The particular brown jacket, the particular way he sat, very straight, with his hands resting rather than fidgeting, because he had learned to occupy exactly the space he needed and no more. He had in turn begun saving her the seat nearest the window at supper, the best seat because the light was good. He had not been asked to do this. He had simply done it once and then kept doing it, with the matter-of-fact consistency of someone who has decided, this is how things are now. These were small things. But Vera had lived long enough, and alone long enough, to understand that small things done consistently are not small. They are the structure that holds the rest up. The trouble came from the school board. There were 3 men on the Hallow Bend school board, and the one who made himself the most prominent was a man named Harcount, the owner of the feed and grain, with the particular confidence of someone who has always been listened to and has come to believe that being listened to is the same as being right. He had heard that the new teacher, the temporary one, already staying longer than expected, had taken on a county placement child, and he had opinions about this, which he shared at the next board meeting, which Vera had been invited to attend, because they were considering whether to offer her the permanent position. "A single woman," Harcount said, "with no permanent address and no family connections in this county, taking on a ward she can't properly provide for. It raises questions about judgment." Vera sat across the table from 3 men and did not look at her hands and did not look at the door. "I have a room," she said. "I have a salary if you offer me this position. I have a reference from the territorial school office and from the superintendent at Billings, and I have a 9-year-old boy who was going to spend the winter in the county system because nobody else stopped." "That's not really," Harcount began. "What would you have had me do?" Vera said. not sharply, plainly, the way you ask when you actually want to know. Harcount had no answer that sounded right, which he seemed to sense because he stopped. The other two board members exchanged a look. One of them, an older man named Alderman Cruz, who ran the livery and had said nothing yet, folded his hands on the table. "She's been covering the class for 6 weeks," Cruz said. "I've had no complaints from parents. I've had several compliments." He looked at Vera. "You'd want a permanent contract?" "Yes," Vera said. "Then you'll have one," Cruz said. Vera did not look at Harcount. She had learned at some point in 28 years of being a woman who wanted things in rooms where men decided things, that looking at the person who opposed you after the decision went your way was a kind of spending you could not afford. She got the position. She told Emmett that evening. He was at the table doing the arithmetic she'd given him, which he worked through with the same focused attention he gave everything. "We're staying, then," he said. "We're staying," she said. He looked at the arithmetic problem in front of him for a moment. Then he went back to it. She had expected more reaction than that. She thought about it later and understood. He had already decided they were staying. He had simply been waiting for her to catch up. The winter was hard, as Montana winters are, which is to say it was hard in ways that people who have not wintered in Montana do not fully imagine until they are inside one. The cold came in November and settled like something with intentions. The school kept because schools in towns like Hollow Bend kept through everything short of structural failure, and Vera taught arithmetic and reading and some history to 11 children between the ages of 6 and 13, of whom Emmett was not the oldest but was, she noted without saying so, the most precise. He was not a show-off about it. He was precise the way a good carpenter is precise, because imprecision creates problems down the line, and he had seen enough problems down the line to prefer avoiding them. The other children, once they'd decided he wasn't a threat, accepted him the way children accept things when the adults around them are not performing anxiety. A girl named Birdie Crane, 8 years old, had appointed herself his unofficial explainer of Hollow Bend's social geography, which Emmett listened to with the patient attention of an anthropologist encountering a new culture. "Birdie talks a lot," Emmett told Vera one evening. "I noticed," Vera said. "She's not wrong, though," he said, "about most of it." Vera looked at him over her mending. "High praise from you." "It's accurate," he said, which was his version of high praise, and which she had come to understand. The first real grief came in January. Vera had known, in a general way, that it would come. A 9-year-old who had lost his mother and then his father and then his home in the span of 2 years did not process all of that in the first weeks. Grief in children does not follow the schedule adults expect of it. It waits. It surfaces when the immediate emergency has passed. And there is enough safety to feel the things that were not safe to feel before. She found him awake at 2 in the morning, sitting at the window of her room with his blanket around his shoulders, looking at the snow falling on Fletcher Street. She sat down beside him. She did not ask what was wrong. She had learned that asking what was wrong when the answer was obvious was a kind of performance that helped no one. After a while, he said, "My father used to say that snow in January meant a good spring." "Was he right?" she said. "I don't know," Emmett said. "I'm 9. I haven't had enough Januaries." Vera looked at the snow. "I think he might have been right," she said. "I've had more Januaries than you, and the bad ones mostly preceded decent springs." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He had good ideas, mostly. He was just unlucky." "Yes," Vera said. "My mother was lucky," he said, "but she got sick." He paused. "It doesn't seem like it should work that way." Vera looked at the window. She had her own accounting on that subject, which she had never said to anyone, and which she found herself considering now, in the dark at 2 in the morning, with a 9-year-old boy sitting beside her. "I lost a sister," she said. 7 years ago. She was the one who was good at things. Good with people, good with money, knew how to make a room feel right. She died of something that was supposed to be minor." She paused. "I've thought about that arithmetic a lot. The people who should have made it, who didn't." Emmett looked at her. How old would she be? Vera thought about it. 31. 32 by now. He looked back at the window. The snow kept falling. "Same age as you, almost," he said. "Same age as me, almost," she said. They sat with that for a while, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind you don't try to fill. After a time, Emmett went back to his cot and slept. Vera sat by the window for another half-hour, looking at the snow, thinking about her sister, and about an October courthouse and $3, and about the particular way things connect that you don't understand until you're standing on the other side of them. Spring came, as it does, and as Emmett's father had apparently believed it would, it came in well. The mud season was shorter than Odette Sayers said she could remember in 15 years. By April, the valley was beginning to be the green that Montana promises in spring and nearly keeps. The school year ended in May. The board confirmed Vera's contract for the following year, with a small increase which Alderman Cruz announced, with the brevity of a man who considers pay increases to be self-evidently correct and in need of no ceremony. Vera had by this time begun to understand that she was staying, not because there was no other option, but because there were other options, and she was not choosing them. She had a contract in a room and an arithmetic student who corrected her when she made errors on the chalkboard, which he did with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who finds mathematical errors genuinely troubling. She had also begun, without quite noticing when it started, to think in the plural. Not my room, but our room. Not whether I stay, but where we'd go. These were small things, but Vera was by now well acquainted with small things and what they accumulated to. She raised it with Emmett that May, on a Sunday, sitting on the back steps of the boarding house in the first real warmth of the year. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the rock he had been examining, which he'd found in the yard and which had a vein of something shiny in it that he'd been studying for 3 days. "All right," he said. He set the rock down. When something needed attention, he gave it attention. "I have a contract for next year," she said, "which means I'll be here. And I've been thinking that being here, for both of us, should probably be more settled than it is." "Settled how?" he said. She looked at the yard. "I'm not your mother," she said. "I know that. And I'm not trying to be something I'm not. But I've been thinking that what I'd like, if it's what you'd want, is to make this legal, properly, so that you're not in a situation where it depends on my staying." Emmett looked at her. He had the expression he had when he was processing, still and thorough and giving the question what it required. "You want to adopt me," he said. "If you'd want that," she said. "Why?" he said. Not as a challenge, as a genuine request for information. She looked at the mountains which were visible from the back steps on a clear day, and which were very clear. "Because you've been saving me the good seat at the table since November," she said, "and because I sat down next to you at a window at 2 in the morning and told you something I'd never told another person, and because—" She stopped, started again. "Because I walked past that courthouse by accident, and I stopped for a reason I didn't understand at the time, and I think I understand it now." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "What's the reason?" he said. She looked at him. 9 years old, with his father's ideas and his mother's luck evened out, maybe, by the fact that he was still here. "Because I needed somewhere to come home to," she said. "And I think you needed someone to come home to. And I think we've been doing a reasonable version of that since October already." Emmett looked at the mountains for a long time. Then he looked at his rock. "I'd want that," he said. The county processed the guardianship in June. Odette Sayers, who had watched the entire situation develop with the satisfaction of someone who had seen a thing go exactly as it should, made a cake that was frankly excessive for 2 people but that they ate over the course of 4 days without complaint. Emmett Greer grew 2 inches the following year, which brought him to a height that was, for a 10-year-old, reassuringly average. He was not, it turned out, small because something was wrong. He was small because he had spent 2 years carrying more than a child should carry, and when he put some of it down, he grew. He was, by 11, the best student in Vera's class, which she managed carefully so as not to make it a thing, but which was simply true. By 12, he had read every book Vera owned and sent away for more. By 13, He had developed an opinion about the territorial government's land policy that was, Vera thought privately, better reasoned than most of what she'd read in the papers on the subject. He told her, at 13, that he intended to study law someday. "I know," she said. "You're not surprised," he said. "You've been building arguments since you were 9, she said. "I was waiting to see what you'd build them about." He almost smiled, actually smiled. The quick, real smile that came occasionally and that changed his whole face into something that looked its age. She had learned not to comment on the smile because commenting on it made it go away. She simply noted it and kept going, which was what it required. Vera taught in Hallow Bend for 14 years. She was not a woman given to declarations. She had said what needed saying on a Sunday in May, on the back steps, and had not found it necessary to add to it. She showed up every day and taught 11 children, and then 14, and then, when the second school was built, 8. And she came home at the end of the day to the house that she and Emmett had moved into when the boarding house became impractical. A small house on Birch Street with a garden she did not tend particularly well, and a table where the seat nearest the window was, by established custom, hers. And eventually the window seat and the understanding between them became something she had not had in 7 years of being alone and had stopped expecting she would find. Something to come home to. Not the family she had been born into. Something else. Something that had been assembled from a courthouse step and a flour sack and $3 and the particular arithmetic of 2 people who had both lost the thing that was supposed to hold them and found, without planning for it, that they had built a new one. On the evening of Emmett's 21st birthday, a June evening, Montana in the full of summer, he came to find her in the garden, where she was making her routine attempt on the tomatoes. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Are you glad," he said, "that you stopped?" She stood up and looked at him, 21 years old. Taller than her now, which had happened somewhere around 15, and which she still occasionally found startling, with the same direct, assessing eyes that had looked at her on a courthouse step and decided she was enough to proceed on. "Every day," she said, "every single day." He nodded, the nod of someone receiving information that confirms what they already knew. Then he went inside to set the table, and Vera went back to the tomatoes, and the June evening settled over Hallow Bend the way evenings do when nothing is wrong. She thought about $3. The last $3 in her pocket on a Friday in October in a town she hadn't planned to stay in, and what they had bought her. Not a responsibility, not an obligation, a reason. The kind you don't go looking for because you don't know you've lost it. And then you find it on a courthouse step in a jacket with the wrong-sized shoulders, and you count out $3. And you don't understand why until much later, sitting by a window in the snow, talking about the people you've both lost, and understanding, finally, that losing them was not the last thing that would ever happen. It wasn't.